My childhood in San Diego. I was born and raised in San Diego, California. That beautiful city where the ocean never feels far away and the sunsets bathe everything in golden light. When I conjure up memories of my earliest years, I see the little yellow house on Pasadena Avenue where every front yard bloomed with bougainvillea, and I can almost smell the salt air that drifted in through my open bedroom window at night. My father, Thomas Carter, was a high school biology teacher, tall and always smiling, with patience for my endless questions about the world. My mother, Margaret, was a librarian who read to me every night before bed. Fairy tales, mysteries, stories about faraway lands and brave children. Those early years were filled with laughter, warmth, and the comfort of routine. My father would make pancakes shaped like dinosaurs on Sunday mornings, and my mother would take me to the local library, letting me pick out as many books as I could carry. Sometimes we drove out to Coronado Beach, where I would collect shells, and my dad would teach me about the tide pools, how tiny starfish clung to rocks, how sea anemones closed up when I touched them softly. Everything felt safe and possible. But when I was 6 years old, everything changed in a way I was too young to understand. My father died suddenly after a brief illness. I remember the silent hush in the house, the way grown-ups whispered in the hallways, and how my mother sat on the edge of my bed every night with tears in her eyes, trying to hide them from me. His absence was a hole I couldn't fill, a missing chair at the table, a quiet where his laugh used to be, an ache that lingered for years. Looking back, I see now how my world began to shrink after he was gone. My mother, who had once been so full of life, drifted further into her grief. The storybooks we'd read piled up, gathering dust. I spent a lot of time alone, drawing pictures of the ocean and listening to neighborhood kids laughing outside, not quite sure how to join them. Still, there were little moments of solace. My mother would sometimes try to emerge from her sadness. She'd braid my hair or take my hand for a walk around Balboa Park, where the jacaranda trees made a purple carpet on the sidewalks. We clung to each other, trying to find new rhythms in a household that no longer made sense. When I was 7, my mother met Linda Richardson, and life would change yet again. But there, between the loss and what came after, sits that brief and golden chapter of my childhood. When I think of San Diego, I remember not only the pain that would follow, but also those early glimmers, the sound of my dad whistling while washing the dishes, my mom's laughter echoing through the garden, the safe embrace of family, even if only for a little while. That was where it all began, in the city where sunlight met the sea, and where I learned, before anything else, what it meant to love and to lose. Those years of suppression. If my earliest childhood had been a sunlit storybook, the years that followed felt more like a house with the lights turned low. When Linda Richardson came into our lives, everything changed. Not like a thunderstorm, sudden and loud, but more like a steady shadow creeping into every corner of our home. At first, I tried to be hopeful, telling myself that Linda would bring warmth back to our house, perhaps even become the friend I'd secretly wished for. But that hope didn't last. Linda moved into our yellow Pasadena Avenue house, bringing with her 2 sons, Steve, older by 3 years, and Brian, just a year younger than me. At first, they seemed curious but distant, their boxes of toys and video games spilling out in the hallway, while Linda unpacked what felt like a whole new set of rules for the household. Gradually, Linda's presence became impossible to escape. She decorated the living room with her own photos, rearranged the kitchen, and shifted our routines so subtly that, after a few months, It felt like nothing of my old life remained. She had a way of making me feel invisible. At dinner, she'd serve Steve and Brian the biggest portions, tossing them easy smiles and asking about their day at school. I'd answer, too, but her eyes rarely met mine. If I forgot to put away my backpack, she'd scold me in front of everyone, her tone sharp and dismissive, while Steve or Brian could leave their shoes anywhere without a single word from her. My mother seemed to shrink in these moments. She hardly ever came to my defense, especially as Linda wove herself further into the fabric of our family. By the time I was 10, I realized I had become a guest in my own home. Linda found ways to cut me out of family plans. Maybe Emily should stay home and read. She's so quiet after all. Or, I think 2 tickets are enough for the concert. Next time, Emily. I was absent from photos, left out of board games, and, worst of all, denied the small kindnesses my father and my mother had once given freely. If I asked for a new notebook for school, Linda might sigh and shake her head. But if Steve or Brian wanted a new game, she'd smile and surprise them the very next day. There were subtle cruelties, too. Remarks that never quite sounded like outright insults, but left me feeling small and awkward. Are you sure you want second helpings, Emily? You're not really athletic like the boys. Or, when I brought home a good grade. That's nice, but Steve is taking honors math, you know. I stopped asking for much. Instead, I disappeared into books, escaped to the little corner of the garden where no one thought to bother me. My world became smaller, quieter, and I learned how to swallow my hurt, how to watch and wait. With every disappointment, a tiny, stubborn part of me began to grow, a whisper inside that kept repeating, "One day, you'll be able to leave all this behind." I think that hope was the only thing Linda couldn't take away from me. Those long, repressed years marked me deeply, but they also forced me to become resourceful, patient, and determined. I didn't know it then, but the girl, learning to live in the shadows, was already building the strength she'd one day need to step out into the light. Hope and determination. I suppose there's a moment, somewhere in the middle of every lonely person's story, when hope becomes a kind of rebellion. For me, that moment unfolded quietly, almost imperceptibly, during my last years of middle school and those first, daunting days of high school. I wasn't entirely alone in the world. I had my mother, but even she felt out of reach, drifting behind walls of her own sorrow, no longer able to shield me from the daily humiliations at home. It would be easy to tell this part of my story as a sad diary of quiet dinners, missed birthdays, and the sting of exclusion. But what I remember most vividly is the stubborn kernel inside me that refused to wither away. Even as my world narrowed and the shadow of Linda's favoritism lengthened, some small voice inside me whispered, "You are more than this. You don't have to accept their definition of you." The transformation started in the school library. It was the only place where I didn't have to worry about being seen, or, more accurately, not being seen at all. Books became both my shelter and my secret arsenal. I devoured stories about faraway places, impossibly brave girls, underdogs who rose against the current. I paused over sentences, copied quotes into a weathered journal, and began to imagine a future that contained something more than simply enduring. It was in 7th grade that I first heard about a summer writing workshop at UC San Diego for public school students. I wanted it more than I wanted anything, more than new clothes, more than a birthday party, even more than Linda's approval. The application fee was $20. I babysat for neighbors and recycled cans around the block until I finally fished out 2 crumpled tens from the bottom of my dresser. When my acceptance letter arrived, I sat on my bed, gripping it so tightly, my knuckles turned white. That summer, as I stepped onto a college campus for the first time, I felt taller. No one there knew anything about my awkward family dinners, or the faint scar on my arm from where Steve, in one of his rare fits of cruelty, had pushed me into the garden gate. They only saw a quiet 12-year-old who asked a lot of questions and wrote stories that made the teachers smile. That was the summer I decided I would go to college. Not just any college, but somewhere far away from San Diego, somewhere that didn't carry the weight of my family's indifference. The way out, I realized, was through my own hard work, my own choices. I mapped everything out in secret, hiding college brochures and scholarship flyers between the pages of old books. I knew there'd be no help from home. Linda barely acknowledged my report cards and seemed to delight in reminding me of the family's tight budget. So I piled schoolwork high on my plate, took every honors and AP class, signed up for every free club that would have me, from debate to yearbook, from mock trial to volunteering at animal shelters. I became a fixture in the library, the last one to leave after meetings or late-night cram sessions. When Linda complained about my late hours, it only fueled me further. High school wasn't easy. While other kids celebrated homecoming and football games, I worked weekends at the corner bookstore, straightening shelves, memorizing the smell of paper and ink. The owner, Mrs. Kaplan, was one of those rare adults who actually saw kids like me. She paid me minimum wage and let me take home battered copies of classics for free. "You've got a sharp mind, Emily," she would say, watching me alphabetize. "Don't let anyone talk you out of aiming high." It was in that store, stacking returns after closing, that I started thinking beyond mere escape. What would I do, really, if I made it out? What kind of life could I build that would never again require me to tiptoe in my own home? Law fascinated me because it felt like the opposite of my powerless childhood. In textbooks and news stories, the law was a kind of shield, a language and a power structure that let even the least visible person stand up and be counted. The more I read about it, the more I realized there could be more to justice than hope and silent endurance. It could be strategy, persistence, preparation. And in learning about it, I might finally learn how to defend myself, not just in court someday, but against the invisible walls people like Linda built around girls like me. My guidance counselor, Mrs. Lee, noticed my grades and the stack of extracurriculars I juggled. She called me into her office during junior year, her smile gentle. "Emily, you ever think about applying to schools out east? Maybe even New York?" The thought electrified me. New York was as far from San Diego as I could possibly imagine. A place of anonymous crowds, possibility, stories happening every second. Mrs. Lee helped me research scholarships, track down fee waivers for applications, and pointed me toward internships and pre-law summer programs. I became relentless, writing essays, prepping for the SATs, even taking a bus across town for a weekend leadership conference I could barely afford. When I was too tired to dream, I let myself daydream on the city bus, picturing the skyline of places I'd only ever seen on TV. At home, things were as bleak as ever. Linda's comments were more barbed now, as if she could sense her grip slipping. "You'll never survive out there, you know," she'd remark one evening as I packed for a debate tournament. "The world's not as soft as you think." I didn't answer her. I no longer needed her to understand my dreams. Senior year, I pieced together every finance option I could find. Pell Grants, work study, odd jobs, and scholarships with names I could barely pronounce. The acceptance letter from New York University came in a thick, glorious envelope. I hid it under my mattress for a full day, afraid it might evaporate if anyone else looked at it. I would need to work, maybe more than one job, and live frugally. But for the first time in years, I felt a buzzing, open sort of excitement. When I finally told my mother, she cried. Not just for me, but, I think, for the girl she used to be, held back by circumstances and other people's expectations. Linda said nothing, just pursed her lips and spun the silver ring on her finger. Steve jeered, Brian shrugged, and I didn't mind at all. Their opinions had finally lost all power over me. In the weeks before I left, I cleaned out my room and boxed up the books that had been my lifeline. I wrote thank you notes to Mrs. Kaplan and Mrs. Lee, promising to make them proud. I stood on the bluff above Ocean Beach on my last night in San Diego, looked out at the endless stretch of water, and realized how far I'd come, not in miles, but in resolve. Hope had ceased to be a childish wish. It had become the blueprint for my future, hammered out in late-night study sessions, long shifts, and the tiny everyday rebellions that said, I am worth fighting for. Determination was my lifeboat, and I meant to row myself as far as I could, never looking back. That's how I left San Diego, not broke or broken, but brimming with the kind of hope that only those who've truly needed it can ever fully know. My past would never define me again. I carried something stronger with me, built from every quiet victory I'd earned along the way. Turning point. Living independently in New York. I can still picture the morning I left San Diego, how the city was shrouded in the soft blue mist that sometimes rose off the ocean at dawn. The way the train tracks near our house gleamed in the early light, and the way my heart thundered with a cocktail of fear and soaring hope. New York had always seemed like a myth, a place I'd glimpsed in movies, read about in the battered paperbacks I smuggled home from Mrs. Kaplan's store, or caught glimpses of during late-night Wikipedia spirals in the corner of my room. I never truly believed the city would open its arms to a girl like me, but sometimes all you need is to believe for a single moment longer than you're supposed to. The weeks leading up to my departure were a blur of cardboard boxes and late-night packing. Linda made no effort to conceal her relief, acting as though my moving out was simply the universe correcting an old mistake. My mother hovered helplessly, desperately tucking extra pairs of socks and reminders to call her into my suitcase. On the last night, she pressed a folded note into my hand, a list of all the phone numbers I might need, written in her looping, careful handwriting. I hugged her tight, and for the first time since I was a child, she whispered, I am so proud of you, Em. Then, finally, it was just me. A suitcase with jammed wheels, a faded backpack stuffed with thrift store sweaters, and a one-way ticket to New York City. Arriving in the city, the first bite of New York was nothing like I'd imagined. I thought I was prepared for the noise and the crowds, for the constant jostle, the way the city never seemed to sleep. But I wasn't ready for the intensity of it, the way the air smelled like hot concrete and ambition, how even the pigeons looked like they had somewhere important to be, the subways rumbling like beasts below the streets. When my bus slid into Port Authority, I didn't step off so much as tumble into a world that was louder, faster, hungrier than any place I'd ever known. It was August. The air felt sticky and electric, filled with the hum of taxi horns and thousands of languages tumbling over each other on the streets. I remember my hands shaking as I clutched the strap of my only bag, body pressed into anonymity by the river of people flowing past me. New York didn't look back, didn't care who I was, or what I'd left behind. There was something both terrifying and freeing in that. I found my way to an overpriced student dorm in the East Village. My entire universe shrunk to a narrow room with stained linoleum floors and a window that rattled every time a truck passed 12 stories below. I had a twin bed, a plastic dresser, and a battered laptop that had survived every slam of Linda's disapproval in my own restless hands. That first night, listening to the city's symphony, sirens, laughter, the wail of a saxophone drifting up from the street, I wondered if I had made the right choice. I barely slept, heart hammering wildly. But as morning breached the dirty window, I realized something beautiful. For the first time in my life, I belonged to myself. The battle of survival, no one tells you how much work it takes to learn to live alone, truly alone. Every day was a test of willpower, resourcefulness, endurance. My first week, I lost my way in the subway. So often it became a bad joke. I locked myself out of my dorm twice. I realized I had no idea how to cook more than ramen and grilled cheese. The city demanded that I grow up quickly. Money was always tight. My scholarships covered tuition and a fraction of the dorm, but for books, bus fare, and groceries, I was on my own. Every week, I scanned bulletin boards for jobs, tutoring, cafe shifts, handing out flyers for hole-in-the-wall falafel joints. I said yes to everything. Some nights, I dragged myself home from a closing shift, hands stained with coffee, voice hoarse from repeating the daily specials. But each time, I collapsed into bed, exhausted and aching. I marveled at the fact that I had earned my own survival. Those first months, it became clear how different New York was from San Diego. In California, sunsets softened everything. In New York, even the light felt sharper, more relentless. The sirens outside were not a nuisance. They were a reminder that life here never paused, never coddled. Yet, something in the city's chaos matched the restlessness inside me. It was the first place I'd ever felt invisible and infinite at the same time. Finding my place. At NYU, I was just another student in a crowd of hopefuls and overachievers, all with stories as complex and bruised as my own. I gravitated toward the library, a familiar haven where solitude was allowed and no one asked about my family. There, I found comfort in the rows of thick legal textbooks, their dense language challenging but oddly soothing. I spent my freshman year learning to listen more than I spoke, to be careful who I trusted, but also to start letting people in. My first friend was Jamie, a philosophy major from the Bronx who wore Doc Martens and an easy, crooked smile. We met in line at a 24-hour diner after midnight, both staring desperately at the dollar menu. Jamie and I bonded over shared thriftiness and an unspoken understanding that sometimes family is something you piece together for yourself. Through Jamie, I met Javier, a whiz at calculus and coffee, whose parents owned the bodega just off Delancey Street. Javier introduced me to the beauty of cheap empanadas and the art of getting a Metro card to stretch just a little bit further. We formed an odd little trio, patchwork, scrappy, stubborn. For the first time, I started to see myself not as a burden, but as someone worth inviting to sit at the table. The legal studies coursework was intense. My professors didn't sugarcoat anything. The law wasn't just an idea here, but a living force that shaped every life and every injustice. I was fascinated and intimidated by the magnitude of what I was being taught. Late at night, back in my dorm, I pored over case studies until my eyes burned, determined to understand every nuance, every precedent. Each time I felt like giving up, I remembered Linda's voice. You wouldn't last a week out there, Emily. That bitterness became fuel. I was determined to prove her wrong. Not for her, but for myself, homesickness and growth. Of course, there were nights when loneliness gnawed at the edges of my newfound confidence. Holidays hit hardest. I watched roommates pack suitcases to go home, to families who would smother them with casseroles and affection. Sometimes I'd walk through Washington Square Park, phone pressed to my ear, listening to my mother's soft voice try to bridge the 3,000-mile gap between us. I learned quickly that home was something I could build, brick by brick, from kindness and hard work. I clung to routines, to budget apps and lists, to finding small pockets of joy, a perfect score on a test, a free concert in the park, a handwritten letter from Mrs. Kaplan in San Diego. The past, with all its cold shoulders and slammed doors, did not follow me here. When Linda called, rarely and usually by accident when trying to reach one of her boys, her approval no longer had the power to wound me. Over time, my fear of failing in New York twisted into pride. I was learning how to navigate the city's brutal beauty, how to flag a cab in a thunderstorm, when to run, and when to hold my ground, which bodegas had the freshest bagels, and what streets to avoid after midnight. For every skinny paycheck, there were lessons earned and victories savored. Transforming from survivor to strategist sophomore year, I landed a coveted internship at the Midtown Legal Aid Society. The interview was nerve-wracking. I wore a borrowed blazer and shoes a half size too small. But something in my story must have struck a chord with the hiring manager. Suddenly, I was spending afternoons in an office surrounded by stacks of case files, learning firsthand how justice was fought for, one exhausting detail at a time. I volunteered for everything, helping prep case briefs, shadowing attorneys in court, answering tense, often heartbreaking phone calls from desperate clients. Some days were overwhelming. I learned that justice, in real life, was messy, slow, and imperfect. But I also saw what hope could look like for people who'd been told no their entire lives. It was in that internship that my vague sense of wanting to make a difference crystallized into a calling. I wanted to be the voice for those still stuck in the dark corners where I'd once lived. The more I learned, the more I realized my own story wasn't unique. I worked alongside interns who had crossed borders alone, who had grown up in foster care, who juggled 2 jobs just to pay rent. We were all grasping for edge of the same ladder, trying to climb our way out. My past, once so shameful to me, became a source of resilience and understanding. Lesson: outside the classroom. New York itself was an education. Every train ride, every sidewalk confrontation, every act of random generosity or rudeness built up my instinct for reading people and situations. I found sanctuary in little things: midnight pizza consumed on the stoop with Jamie, a secondhand scarf from a Harlem street vendor, the thrill of seeing the Manhattan skyline from the Brooklyn Bridge at sunrise. These memories became part of my foundation, the inner scaffolding that kept me upright during hard times. I also started giving back. On weekends, I volunteered at a community center in Queens, tutoring immigrant kids who reminded me of myself, quiet, determined, learning English with heads bowed over tattered workbooks. I saw in their eyes the same mixture of hope and hard-won wisdom, and I realized something. I was proud of the person I was becoming, someone solid, empathetic, and unafraid to disrupt the world that had once tried to mute her. Becoming my own advocate senior year approached too quickly, a blur of applications, LSAT prep, and job interviews. Life was still hard. The city demanded everything, and gave nothing for free. There were moments I wondered if I'd made the right choice, leaving everything familiar behind for a city that never promised to love me. But New York never pretended. It gave back exactly what you fought for, and that clarity was itself a comfort. When I graduated summa cum laude, my mother flew out for the first time. We stood arm in arm at the foot of the Washington Square Arch while she wiped away proud tears. "You did this yourself, Em. Nobody can take that from you." For the first time, I believed it too. At 26, after 3 years of grinding through law school, balancing classes, internships, court appearances, and nights when all I had for dinner was black coffee and hope, I passed the New York bar. Landing my first job at a respected Manhattan law firm, I looked around the sleek office, ran a hand along the mahogany desk, and allowed myself a small, private smile. Linda's voice, once a chain around my spirit, faded into irrelevance. The world had not broken me. Instead, New York had changed me, pushed and sharpened me, first into a survivor, then into an advocate, and finally into the kind of woman who could own her own narrative, no matter how messy or unexpected. A home of my own. I moved into a tiny apartment in Brooklyn, with cracked tiles, a view of the subway tracks, and walls thin enough to hear my neighbor's blues guitar late at night. It was mine. I furnished it slowly, with mismatched chairs, a secondhand bookshelf, of course, and a plant that, against all odds, remained green. For the first time, my life was one of my own making. I could shut the door and feel safe, not silent. Sometimes, I caught myself grinning, walking through the city with a coffee and case folder in hand, feeling like I could finally breathe. For every unkind word in my past, there was now a chorus of challenges conquered and friendships forged. I began to dream forward, not just about survival, but about joy and justice, about using my voice to tilt the balance for others the way I'd vowed to do in those long, lonely San Diego nights. Conclusion. The turning point. Looking back, I see that New York didn't save me. No city, no place, ever could. What saved me was learning to show up for myself, over and over, through failures and triumphs alike. The city was only the crucible in which I was tested and tempered, where fear and hope became the building blocks of a new self. Here, amid the chaos and the concrete, I claimed my past without shame and my future without apology. That was my turning point, realizing that no one else would hand me the life I wanted, but also that I, at last, had everything I needed to forge it for myself. Return. The first confrontation. It's strange how the city you loved as a child can feel like foreign soil when you return as an adult. I'd been away from San Diego almost a decade, long enough to earn my degrees and win my own safety, long enough to carve out a new story for myself, one that didn't endlessly spiral around Linda's bitterness or the echo of my mother's sadness. Yet, when the call came that my stepfather was gravely ill, I found myself swallowing all those years of hard-fought distance and booking a flight home. San Diego's air was as I remembered, warm, a little salt-laced, holding memories in every breeze. But it also felt smaller, like the rooms in a childhood home that once loomed enormous and now seemed to shrink around your adult shoulders. As the taxi wound through old neighborhoods, I rehearsed my lines, polite, calm, invulnerable. That was the armor New York had given me. I didn't intend to let my composure slip, not in front of Linda or her sons. The house on Pasadena Avenue looked faded, the paint a little cracked. Bougainvillea spilled over the fence, but wasn't trimmed as it had been when my mother was alive. Someone had left empty plant pots on the porch. It wasn't home anymore, Not to me. But I walked up the steps, rang the bell, and waited with a heart that thudded somewhere between anticipation and dread. Linda opened the door. She had aged, but in the brittle, tight way people do when bitterness hardens instead of softening lines. Her silver hair was pulled into the same severe knot. She stared at me for a full heartbeat before stepping aside. "Emily," she said, not quite a greeting, not an accusation, just acknowledgement. I was, inexplicably, still real. Inside, the first surprise was how little had changed. The same family photos hung on the wall, years of birthdays, graduations, Christmases, but none with me in the center. The living room, with its mismatched furniture, still felt like a place where I was expected to take up as little space as possible. My stepbrothers, Steve and Brian, sat at the kitchen table. Steve looked up, smirked, and gave a mock salute. "Wow, the prodigal daughter returns. What's it been? 10 years? And no calls?" I could have let his comment snag, could have let myself curl inside the old humiliation, but I didn't. "Nice to see you too, Steve," I said quietly. "How's your job?" I knew for a fact that he had bounced between half a dozen, never sticking anywhere long. Brian just shrugged, focusing on the phone in his hand, eyes flicking up and down. If he felt anything about my return, he hid it well. Linda folded her arms over her chest. "You're here about Bill, I assume? Finally decided family matters after all these years?" "Mom told me he was ill," I replied, refusing to bite at the accusation. Bill, my stepfather, lay weak and semi-conscious in a back bedroom, the result of a long, slow decline sped up by what the doctor called complications. I had no warm feelings left for Bill, but I remembered how he'd once tucked me in after nightmares, long before Linda wore down the last of his kindness. He'd chosen to let her rule the house, but he wasn't, in his way, cruel. I spent the afternoon in that hush peculiar to sick rooms, watching him breathe, listening to the hollow tick of the wall clock, wishing that memory could absolve pain. That night, I walked the halls, remembering my child self, lurking in the threshold, seeking warmth, always wary. The house felt even colder. But I was not a trapped little girl anymore. It was day 2 when the first true storm broke. I'd expected awkward conversation, chilly silences, maybe an outright fight. What I had not expected was the mountain of paperwork stacked in the living room, left recklessly open. Bills, account statements, legal mail. Somewhere among them, like an ember sparking in dry brush, was a letter addressed to me, unopened and months old. I recognized the handwriting as the family lawyer's. Linda saw me standing over it and bristled. "Those are not for you." I met her gaze. "You have a letter from Mr. Sanderson, addressed to me. I'll be taking it if you don't mind." I could feel both Steve and Brian watching, an old tension crackling in the room. I slid the envelope into my bag and retreated to the guest room. There, finally safe, I tore it open. The letter was short, formal, almost cold. Notification that my late father's trust had come up for review, and a request to contact the office regarding disbursement records. The reading knocked the wind out of me. I'd always assumed, wrongly it turned out, that my inheritance had been handled properly after I turned 18, that whatever my father had left for me had been managed according to the instructions in his will. But the more I sat with those old files, the more cracks I found. Investment accounts that listed Linda Richardson, guardian, well past my 18th birthday. Withdrawals marked for household expenses, far outstripping my basic share. My signature missing on annual reports. A feeling of hot, electric anger started to churn beneath my ribs. I spent the next day in the public library, poring through records online, matching account numbers and statements. It was as if my old research habits, honed in grad school and law libraries, had been waiting all these years for this moment. My father had left me enough to pay for college, to start a modest adult life. But almost all of it had vanished, piecemealed away for family needs. There were transfers to Steve and Brian, fees for Linda's car, even home renovations done years after my 18th birthday. Red flags, all of them. I realized, with a sick kind of clarity, that my stepfamily had not just resented me, they had stolen from me. Not in some metaphorical sense, but with numbers and signatures and paperwork. I felt the past, every cruel word, every awkward silence, collapse on itself into a point of focus. Now I had the training, the confidence, and the ability to do something about it. I didn't sleep much that night. Old ghosts and the glow of my laptop screen kept me company as I filled out spreadsheets, made lists, drafted emails to the lawyer who should have been mine all along. The anger that used to make me feel powerless now ran alongside a cold determination. I would not let this be another hurt I had to simply swallow. That morning, I sat across from Linda at the kitchen table. She was sorting pills into a weekly tray, mouth pinched, hands shaking. "I need to talk about my father's estate," I said, voice even. She set down the pill box sharply. "I knew this was coming. You always were an ungrateful child. Bill and I did everything for you, and now you come sniffing after money?" I didn't rise to it. There are transactions on the trust account, withdrawals that shouldn't have been made after I was legally an adult. I need you to explain them. Mr. Sanderson, my father's lawyer, wrote me. He's waiting for answers, as am I. Steve leaned in from the hallway, arms crossed, face all scorn. "You think you're better than us now, just 'cause you're a lawyer in New York?" I looked at him, really looked, and saw the boy who'd once locked me in a closet for fun, the teenager who'd shrugged when Linda dismissed me from family movie nights. "No," I said, "I think I'm smarter than you gave me credit for, and I have the patience to see this through." Linda's lips puckered, white with fury. "You have no idea the sacrifices we made. You should be grateful we took you in when your mother—" I cut her off. "Don't. My father left me enough because he cared what happened to me. What you did, what you've all done, is theft." It was the first time I'd ever spoken to Linda on equal footing. No trembling, no apology. Just the facts laid bare. In the days that followed, things grew tense. Steve stormed out. Brian retreated further. Linda took to slamming cabinets so hard the glasses rattled. But the mood had shifted. I contacted the family lawyer. I filed formal requests for records. Mr. Sanderson, sensing the change in the air, grew helpful quickly, sending old account statements, tracing the paper trail. I stayed in San Diego longer than planned. Bill passed away quietly one afternoon. A thin, frail shell of the man who'd once hauled me onto his shoulders at the zoo. I sat with him at the end. Neither of us had words left, but I wished him peace before I went to face the others. At the lawyer's office, Linda tried to bluster her way through explanations. "It was all for the good of the household," she repeated. "You never needed anything. Steve and Brian are not the heirs to my father's estate," I said, quietly but unapologetically. The evidence was irrefutable. Checks transferred illegally, false expense reports, my own signature forged more than once. Mr. Sanderson leaned back in his chair. "I advise you, Mrs. Richardson, to work on a restitution agreement. If you cannot, Emily has every right to pursue full criminal and civil remedies." There was no dramatic confession, no teary apology. Linda simply stared at the table, hands clenched. Steve muttered curses under his breath. Brian looked sullen and afraid for the first time since I'd returned. For so long, they had expected me to fold, to take whatever scraps I was given. They had not counted on my becoming the woman I needed. That evening, as the golden California sun slanted through the window, I sat alone in my childhood bedroom, a little older, a little more scarred, but not defeated. The walls held old pencil marks, measuring the years I'd survived. The bedspread was threadbare, but I was no longer trapped by what had been denied to me. Before leaving San Diego, I took one last walk along Ocean Beach. The tide pulled steadily at the sand. Indifferent to history, I tossed a pebble into the frothy surf, a small goodbye to the girl who had always hoped for something more. My shadow stretched behind me, long and certain. My new life, I realized, rested on a foundation I'd built myself, out of memory, justice, and the unbreakable certainty that I was, after all, my father's daughter. And for the first time, I felt not only vindicated, but free. Truth, in the law, speak up, in. The weeks that followed, San Diego became less a backdrop for old grievances and more a battleground for justice, a place where my past and present collided, not just emotionally, but legally. For so long, my stepfamily had wielded power through silence and control, certain I would never find the voice to resist them. Now, armed with evidence and the weight of law behind me, I was determined to prove they were wrong. The process moved forward quickly once Mr. Sanderson, my father's longtime attorney, understood how much had been hidden, even from him. Together, we compiled every last piece of documentation I could gather: bank statements, trust account records, old emails, receipts in Linda's handwriting, forged signatures. With each page added to the folder, I felt a curious mixture of pain and vindication. Yes, they had stolen from me. Yes, this family had thrived on injustice. But now every misdeed was a fact, not just a ghost story replaying in my head. Filing the civil complaint was oddly anticlimactic. A stack of paperwork and a court fee, nothing more. Still, as I stood outside the courthouse, beneath a bright California sky, I felt the gravity of the moment settle in. I was no longer the powerless girl they remembered. I was someone who could fight back, insist on her rights, and use the very language of law and justice that had once been my distant dream. Linda, predictably, tried to stall. Through her lawyer, an unfriendly, defensive man who only bothered to feign politeness to me in the hallways. She pushed for delays and even attempted half-hearted negotiations. For Steve and Brian, the idea that I would actually bring in lawyers, publicly, with witnesses, was almost unthinkable. I overheard Steve mutter in the corridor on the first hearing day, "She's making a spectacle out of nothing, just wants to embarrass us." But this wasn't about spectacle. This was about truth. The first court appearance was both surreal and deeply grounding. I took the stand, my hands steady beneath the table, despite my racing pulse. My lawyer, a measured, sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Guerrero, guided me through the details: how Linda retained control of the trust after my 18th birthday, why the withdrawals far exceeded normal living expenses, how my signature was nowhere to be found on crucial documents. I answered every question calmly, refusing to let emotion muddy the record. There would be a time to grieve again, just not now. On the other side, Linda's testimony shifted from lofty indignation to stumbling self-justification. We were a family. She always had a roof, food, clothes, she argued, her voice rising. But Ms. Guerrero remained unflappable, presenting the judge with timelines and inconsistencies, empty account ledgers, emails in which Linda referred to using Emily's fund for Steve's car repairs. The numbers didn't just tell a story. They formed a cage in which no amount of manipulation could hide. Steve tried to play dumb. Brian barely spoke, shrinking inside himself at every question. I watched them as an outsider now, noting the way guilt and fear tangled in their faces. There was no satisfaction in witnessing their discomfort, only a quiet ache, a wish that things could have been different, that we could have all become something better. But as the judge read the summary of the case aloud, I felt something heavy begin to lift from my shoulders. The judge's decision was clear, concise, and decisive. Linda had not only violated her fiduciary responsibilities, she had committed various civil offenses, breach of guardianship, misappropriation of funds, even, potentially, fraud. The order was for full restitution, plus compensatory damages, and a stern warning that criminal investigation could follow if compliance was not immediate. Linda's face, usually so composed, now sagged with the weight of consequence. Even then, she looked at me, still searching for the frightened child she could shame into submission. But I didn't look away. I owed her nothing more. Not deference, not pity, not forgiveness. The scales had finally tipped, not toward vengeance, but toward simple, stubborn justice. There were layers to the aftermath. It took months to untangle my father's remaining assets. Months for Linda to sell off pieces of her comfortable life, to pay back what she owed. Steve started packing for a move, blaming Linda without irony for putting him in this position. Brian, ever the silent one, sent me a curt email. 3 lines, no punctuation. I didn't know everything. I'm sorry, goodbye. I didn't reply. Closure looks different for everyone. I used the first restitution check for something symbolic. I paid off the remainder of my student loans, the final chain tying me to old, borrowed time. The rest would go into my future, a future built on my terms, with no debts to the past, except the lessons I chose to keep. There were nights when the bitterness threatened to return. Justice, after all, does not undo harm. It only acknowledges it. But in the odd quiet of my Brooklyn apartment, my shelves lined with the very books that had once shielded me, now testaments to survival, I realized I was no longer waiting for an apology. Vindication had come not as an emotional reckoning, but as a restoration of balance. The law, impartial and unyielding, had spoken in my stead. It had said, "What happened to you matters." I made a silent vow, then, to never let fear or self-doubt silence my sense of rightness again. My career in law, which began as a desperate search for protection, had transformed into something hopeful, a tool to defend, advocate, and deliver what so many never receive. A chance to be heard, to lay claim to the truth of their own lives. In the end, the public record closed not just a painful chapter, but an entire book I'd always kept hidden. Every struggle I'd endured, every cruelty I'd survived, now stood alongside my victories in the official history of who I was. And with the gavel's final echo, I walked out of that San Diego courthouse, into the sunlight, free, at last, to belong wholly to myself. Cold confrontation, claiming ownership of my life. The final chapter with my stepfamily didn't unfold in heated arguments or public scenes, as I might have once imagined. After the ruling, San Diego became less of a battleground and more like a set from an old play. Rooms left in shadow, lines memorized and recited by bitter actors who'd never truly seen me. I didn't want revenge or pity, only space to breathe in the truth and to lay claim, at last, to the life I'd built out of resilience and will. The last meeting was inevitable. There were documents to sign, keys to collect, practicalities that no judge or attorney could make disappear. When I returned to the Pasadena Avenue house for what I knew would be the final time, the world outside was flooded with an autumn light so sharp and gorgeous that it made every faded surface seem more poignant. Old paint, overgrown bougainvillea, the sidewalk where I'd once drawn crooked hopscotch squares as a child. My heart thudded, not with dread this time, but with a kind of solemn resolve. Linda, Steve, and Brian were already waiting in the living room, each taking up far too much space in ways that had once almost suffocated me. Linda sat straight-backed in the old blue armchair, her mouth pinched, her fingers busy folding and unfolding a scrap of tissue. Steve paced near the fireplace, restless and scowling, while Brian, slumped in a dining chair, eyes fixed on some invisible point just past the window. Once, I'd have hesitated at the threshold, measuring my words, shrinking small. But the years and the battle were behind me now. I crossed the room, the only sound the quiet click of my shoes on polished wood. "Let's get started," I said, my voice calm but unfamiliar, even to me. Firm, unwavering, adult. The paperwork was routine. A property transfer here, an acknowledgement of restitution there. Linda's hand shook as she signed, and for a moment her resolve seemed to shatter. I watched as Steve's eyes darted from me to his mother and back again, searching for someone to blame. Gone were the days when their moods could shift the direction of my life, when a single sharp word could send me running for cover. This time, I was the one in command of myself, my story, everything. We worked through the final legalities in grim silence. As the last signature dried, I gathered the set of brass keys that had unlocked the front door for decades. Keys that had kept me shut out as much as they had ever welcomed me in. Steve broke the silence first. "So that's it? You win, we lose, and now you're just, what, kicking us out?" I met his gaze. "You're not children, Steve. The court was clear. This is my father's house, and it's up to me to decide what to do with it now." I paused, and then, making sure my tone held no triumph or malice, added, "You have a month to collect your things and find new arrangements. The same court order that repaid what was stolen also gives you that grace period. After that, I'll need the house back for good." He sneered, frustration etched deep. "You think this makes you better than us? You think a couple of law books and courtroom drama changes what you are?" It was so familiar. The bait, the attempt to drag me into an old dynamic where I was always made to feel less. But I didn't need his approval, or even his understanding. "No," I said quietly. "It's not about being better or worse. It's about drawing the line between what was theirs to take and what belongs to me now." Brian remained silent, barely looking up. Sometimes I thought he resented me less than the others, but the years of complicity had built their own walls between us. If he felt guilt or regret, it played out privately, behind eyes that had always been elsewhere. But it was Linda who held my attention most, the woman who had, in so many ways, orchestrated my years in the shadows. She sat with her lips pressed so hard they went white. When I finally faced her, I saw not the tyrant of my childhood, but a weary old woman, brittle and defeated. She spoke, her voice rough at the edges. "You should be careful, Emily. Family is all you have in the end. That's what your mother forgot. And now look what you've done. Broken everything." There was a time when I would have been undone by those words, would have let them slice into old wounds and taken the blame. But I'd learned, slowly, that survival sometimes demands a necessary coldness, a refusal to carry burdens not of your own making. I met her stare, and this time did not flinch. Family isn't about blood or proximity, I said, steady. It's about how you show up for each other, about loyalty, honesty, and kindness. You taught me a lot, Linda. Mainly, what not to do. Now I get to decide who I call family and what legacy I leave behind. For a long moment, nobody said anything. I thought about how many nights I had prayed for acceptance in this house, how hard I tried to win scraps of tenderness from these people. In the end, it hadn't been love that set me free, but truth and the cold, healing distance of time. Gathering my things, each a symbol of my journey, documents, boxes of old books, photos that had never been allowed on the mantel, I took one last look at the room so filled with history and absence. The silence felt heavy, but also ripe with possibility. After I'm gone, I said, turning back at the threshold, do what you need to. But know this, I'm not carrying any of this forward. I'm not another casualty of old bitterness or empty debts. I own my future now, and I wish you peace, or as much of it as you are willing to take. I stepped outside, sun dazzling off the sidewalk. Somewhere, a dog barked, and children's laughter drifted from a yard down the block. It struck me with fresh clarity how small a part the people in that house now played in the total arc of my life story. Back in the city, with the transfer of property complete and every legal thread neatly tied, I let myself grieve. But this time it was a clean pain, a shedding, not a festering. I stayed one night alone in the old house, sleeping on a mattress in the room that once held my childhood dreams. The next morning, I roamed its empty halls, fingering grooves in the plaster, reading my name still carved, after all these years, faintly on the inside of a closet door. There was no sense of vindication, only relief, a liberation from the need to prove myself or to make others witness my worth. The house was nothing more now than a blank slate, a shell, if I chose to sell it, donate it, or make it into something entirely my own. That decision would come from clarity, not compulsion. In my last walk through the barren garden, I let myself remember flashes of everything. The father who taught me to love the ocean, the mother who'd whispered fierce stories in the dark, the lonely afternoons spent eavesdropping on laughter from other rooms. And I said a silent farewell, not just to them, but to the self I'd had to put away to survive. Back in Brooklyn weeks later, my keys heavy on a ring. Old and new worlds, both represented. I hosted a small dinner for the people who had become my family. My mother, finally restored to herself and to me. Friends like Jamie and Javier, who had seen me raw and had chosen to stand by my side. Even Mrs. Kaplan, flown in from San Diego and beaming as she surveyed the cluttered bookshelves of my apartment. If anyone noticed the lingering sadness in my eyes, they offered warmth, not questions, comfort, not judgment. That night, as the city buzzed below, I raised a glass and claimed, without apology or hesitation, the life I'd painstakingly crafted from the ruins. To everyone at this table, thank you for being the family I chose. This is just the beginning. In that quiet, ordinary moment, I felt the full weight and lightness of finally being the author of my own life. No more thresholds guarded by bitterness, no more battles for crumbs of affection, only the open horizon and the certainty that nothing and no one could ever again make me small. I turned out the lights, letting gratitude flood through me, for freedom, for dignity, and for the power to claim, at last, that everything I was and would become belonged, irrevocably, unapologetically, to me.